Qin Shang or Zhou, or Zhou Qin or Qin Han. These dynasties were lost and founded by a military coup within the ruling houses themselves. So the sort of military families would take control from the emperor and the palace itself, the emperor, and then another military family would rise up and take control from them. So it was never a very stable model because you were constantly jockeying for position. So there was, once again, a tension between these military leaders of these other dynasties and these aristocratic families that were from the north originally, but now transplanted themselves to the south, who held themselves sort of apart from military matters and turned more towards the idea of culture. And so there's a sort of cleavage between the military and the cultural at that period. There's also a cleavage between regional groups. So there was already an indigenous population that was in the south before these ruling families arrived from the north after 317. There was already a population of Chinese that had gotten there earlier, right? And then now these northern Chinese were there. So there were three groups: the indigenous people who were actually non-Chinese had always been there, the Chinese that arrived before the Song Dynasty period, and then the newly arrived aristocratic families. They were all sort of jockeying for position as well. So there was a lot of tension along different lines during this period. It was a time of great cultural foment and very fertile as well, maybe for that reason. Many people decided to retreat from politics because it was so unstable. So we get this sort of efflorescence or burgeoning of cultural production. A few major figures I'll point out. One is probably one of China's most famous poets, Hao Qian and Hao Yunming, early in this period, who refused. He said he will not bow down to a petty official for a bushel of rice. Right? So he gave up his job and he retired to his garden and field. And adopted this stance of when your mind is set far apart from worldly matters, then whatever place you're in automatically becomes remote from the mental attitude. And this is indicative of sort of new cultural attitude that's not engaged with politics, not engaged with power at the center, but is now sort of forging its own cultural sphere that is separate from the center. It's very much binary opposition at this point, though. Later, the idea of a cultural sphere separate from power will be integrated within power itself. There'll be a whole class of literati officials that have sort of a cultural sphere outside of their jobs as officials. But in the time of Hao Yunming, it's an either-or sort of thing. Either you serve as an official and you're completely compromised, or you go off into the back garden and field and become a pure poet, which is what he claims to have done. I'm not going to read it here, but you can look at it. I've posted slides when I post them, you can look at it. Of a famous poem about that very topic. Other famous cultural productions that came out of the Six Dynasties period, or Southern Dynasties period. You'll often see here Six Dynasties, which is a little bit more inclusive. It includes some of the northern, western Jin and eastern Jin, as well as the Southern Dynasties. Or you'll hear the term Southern Dynasties. They both refer to this period when China was broken up into a northern non-Chinese part and a southern Chinese part. So I'm talking about the cultural production in the south part coming from the Chinese ruling lineage. Another famous figure was a calligrapher by the name of Wang Xizhi, who got together with a bunch of friends. There were very popular literary salons at the time. And one famous party they had, they would sit by a river and they would float wine cups down the river. Whenever it bumped into the shore, you'd have to pick it up and drink it and compose a poem. Or you'd have to compose a poem, and if you couldn't compose it, then you'd have to drink. The poems were all collected together by Wang Xizhi, who then wrote this preface for them. And this preface became the most famous piece of calligraphy in Chinese history. This is not the original. This is a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and so on. So who knows whether it actually looked like this. Supposedly the original was owned by a Tang Dynasty emperor who loved it so much that he was buried with it. But it had been copied before he took it to his grave. So another sort of treasure Chinese culture that came out of this period in terms of calligraphy. And it's copied. Everyone that learns Chinese calligraphy has to learn how to do calligraphy like Wang Xizhi, one of the great masters, one of the poets of the most class. Painters were famous in this period too. The most famous one being Gu Kaishi. Here's an interesting sort of convergence. I talked about Hao Zhi before as a poetic figure in the Pre-Phoenix period, the Zenan period, and he wrote a poem called the Ruo Goddess, or Ruo Shengfu, and then Wu Kaizhi, a century later, did a painted illustration of it. And this is a scroll, so you would read it, you would open it from the end, and as you would look at it, roll it up, and you would travel through it almost through time, so you're sort of going through the poem as a narrative and you're following it visually. This is why the figures will appear again and again, because they're the same figures at different points in the narrative. And so this is, I guess, the period in which we have individual sort of creative names like Tao Qian and Wu Kaizhi, or the Wang Xuzhi, sort of idea of culture being attached to individuals. But there was still a lot of cultural activity at court as well. It was just on a much smaller scale. So the southern dynasties, the Song, Qi, Liang, and Chen, some people include the Eastern Jin as one of the southern dynasties. They were at Qingyun as well. They all had their capital at what was called Jinling at the time. Now we know it as Nanjing, literally meaning southern capital. Here it is in modern times. These are all recreations. The wall might be the original wall, I don't know. The building was certainly modern recreation, but it's a picture of Jinling today. And most of the culture was at court, at the original court. And the reason this is an extremely important period of the Southern Dynasty is it is the conduit through which all our knowledge and all our texts and all our sources of the Han Dynasty and before travel. So everything, a lot of material artifacts were lost in the north. And so basically whatever the Chinese ruling elite could carry away from the warfare in the north to the south, that's what was preserved. So there are some famous anthologies that were put together in this period, the most famous being called the Literary Collection. So most of what we have of Han Dynasty literature comes from this anthology that was put together during the Southern Dynasty, as well as historical materials, and the classics themselves were preserved through the Southern Dynasty court. So they're extremely important in terms of preserving Chinese culture, but as well as shaping Chinese culture through making anthologies, through their commentaries and so forth. So a lot of what we think of as a reflection of Han Dynasty or before is more a reflection of editors and anthologists in the Southern Dynasty constructing their picture of the Han Dynasty. This is true for literature as well as history. So it's just, I want to make you aware of the kind of lens sometimes that you use. It's sort of important to be aware of that. But to step away from that, I want to talk about a process called deracination, so uprooting the one native soil. This is what's happening. There's some, by some counts, 17% of the Chinese population moved to the south after 217. 17%. So that doesn't sound like very many people. But 60% of the aristocratic families, the ruling families, the ones that were preserved in culture and transmitting culture, moved. And in doing so, they were moving away from or leaving homes behind that they had occupied for generations and generations. So this homeland of Confucius was in the north, the homeland of the Zhou dynasty, the Shang dynasty. Everything is all up in the north, and they're leaving it all behind and moving to the south. And this has ramifications for culture, because what happens is now culture is not something rooted in the very soil around you, in the very site, temples and battlefields and so forth around you, but now culture is something that's portable. Culture is something that becomes personal, and that's something we learn through books. And it also becomes much more open to interpretation and invention. Right? So what we see in this age of disunion, both in the north and the south, by the way, I shouldn't forget the north, both the north and the south, whether they're being run by Chinese families, ruling families, or non-Chinese ruling families, they are all very much open to new ideas, new sources, new texts, new thought, new ways of doing things. There's a very strong hybrid culture in the north, and there's also a hybrid culture in the south as well. There are non-Chinese people in the south who are interacting with intermarrying with the Chinese ruling families. So there's a strong sense of hybridization and openness to foreign ideas. And so now the sort of traditional Chinese culture, which was rooted, is now just another culture, right, that can now interact with these, what would previously be thought of as foreign or alien cultures, can now interact with this sort of more Confucian culture and produce new ideas and new ways of life and new interpretations. The classical culture was still a common culture among the ruling elites, but now it's encountering other cultures. So that leaves an opening to different religious so to compete with Confucianism and say, some people say Confucianism isn't really a religion, it's a ritual, it's a system of ritual based on ancestor worship. But there are two religious systems that now start to compete directly with Confucianism. One of them is Taoism, and the other one is Buddhism. And I spoke about Taoism previously, and I just want to say at this point, what happened is a sort of transformation of Taoism from a philosophical school of thought based on a certain few texts. It now turns into a full-blown, well, it has been already, but it really explodes as a religion, with temples, with monks, with the whole pantheon of deities, the whole sort of aesthetic, visual culture, and as well as textual culture, all sorts of this explosion of Taoist texts being written at the time. And so Taoism really takes off as an alternate religion to Confucian practice. And then the other religious system that explodes at the time is Buddhism. Buddhism is different from Taoism because Taoism is native to China at the time. It's just growing by leaps and bounds, but it was always there for centuries beforehand. Buddhism comes from somewhere else in India. So, I'm going to, in this one slide and maybe a few minutes, tell you everything you need to know about Buddhism before as a thought system before we talk about Buddhism in China. So hopefully by the end of this you'll attain enlightenment and you'll be on the rest of the course. So what is Buddhism? Well, let's start off talking about historical Buddha, the man known as Buddha, who's known his name is Siddhartha, who lived, the latest scholarship says, in around 500 BC. He's also known as Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakya tribe as well. And I'm not going to tell the full life story, but he was wealthy, and he saw that wealth didn't bring him happiness, and he saw the suffering in the world, and he realized what he called four noble truths one day when he was meditating. And the first noble truth is that life is sorrow. You have to recognize that first. And then if you want to identify where sorrow comes from from craving, it comes from wanting things, desiring things, being attached to things. And people, by the way. That's the part that really gets me Buddhism. You're supposed to be honest about all your family relationships as well, because they are a form of attachment and craving. So if that's the case, the only way to stop sorrow is to stop craving and put an end to craving. And his answer to that was another number list. To stop craving, you have to follow the discipline of the Eightfold Path. This is the very core of Buddhism at this point. And so the path now, this is the sort of philosophical understanding of how the human mind works and consciousness. But now there's a discipline which has to be brought to the human mind. So the Eightfold Path is you recognize suffering for what it is. You decide, you make a decision to stop it. That's the first step. And then the way you stop it is through right, correct, or upright conduct, speech, livelihood, endeavor, awareness, and contemplation. And no one said it was going to be easy. You have to make sure that the way you conduct yourself, the way you speak, the way you pursue your livelihood, your goals, and what you're trying to achieve are all correct, as well as staying aware in the moment, and then also taking time to meditate and contemplate. And the reason you do all of these things is because you want to escape from the world of suffering, which is known as samsara, or the wheel of reincarnation. Now, this is the most misunderstood aspect of Buddhism, I believe. The idea of samsara, reincarnation, later in the Chinese context did come to mean actually coming back as a different being, right? So if you're not following proper conduct in speech and livelihood, then you might come back as a dog or something. That is a later sort of interpretation that's put upon original Buddhist teaching. The original Buddhist teaching, the idea of reincarnation is you don't come back as a sentient being, is that you are just a collection of elements, right? You're a collection of blood and skin and bone and some sort of consciousness. And then when you die, those elements go back to nature, and your consciousness also goes back to nature. And then they're reassembled and they come back in some other way. But it's not like your soul or something is intact and goes to another generation. It's just that you are constantly trapped in this larger wheel of everything breaking apart, coming back together, breaking apart, coming back together. So these forms do bear traces. Oh, so sorry. The goal is to stop, to get out of this wheel of reincarnation by stopping your suffering. through contemplation, correct behavior. And the goal is to attain a state of nirvana, right, which is to extinguish all desire and attachment, and once you've done that, you will stop suffering and you will no longer come back again as a suffering, desiring creature in the world of samsara. The problem is that our behavior, this conduct, speech, and livelihood, and so forth, leaves traces which follow us through reincarnation, called karma. And so karma can be good or bad, depending on your behavior, which can lead you closer to nirvana or further away from nirvana. And there are a few more things I should point out. There were the idea of the three treasures of Buddhism, the Buddha himself, as an example of the person who had this initial insight and attained enlightenment and nirvana, the Dharma, or the teaching of Buddha, or the truth of Buddha, and then the Sangha, which is the community, often figures itself as monasteries and nunneries and temples and so forth. But it can also include lay people, practical lay people, in the community of Buddhists as well. And these two things are treasure. If you attain Buddhahood, the last stage of your life, when you actually attain enlightenment and you're not going to come back anymore, you've attained nirvana, you're called an arhat. And these people will move on and attain Buddhahood. Some of these people decide to remain behind and not move on to enlightenment and nirvana. They decide to stay in samsara in order to help other people through the Eightfold Path, help other people attain nirvana. These are known as bodhisattvas. Enlightened ones remain to help others. They're often referred to as nowadays saints. So these are some terms that you should be familiar with because they'll all come up in the East Asian context of Buddhism in various degrees. Particularly in the visual culture, you'll see arhats and bodhisattvas and Buddhas. And there starts to be more than one Buddha as well, as the philosophy becomes more and more metaphysical and religious. What else did I want to say? Oh, and the two main schools. Important. So the original schools in India and in parts of Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, the sort of oldest school is known as the Theravada school. But then in China and Korea and Japan as well, and East Asia, the most popular school was the Mahayana school, which did sort of tweak some of these ideas and change them. For instance, Mahayana is the one that talks about reincarnation is actually coming back, and you'll come back as a dog or an insect or something like that. As well, Mahayana preaches that we all have Buddhahood within us, right? And it's a matter of finding it, and then you can become enlightened, and that the bodhisattvas will help us do this. And there's a whole sort of pantheon of bodhisattvas that explodes once Mahayana takes hold. It's a much more, they call themselves the greater vehicle because their criticism of the Theravada school is the Theravada school is only good for one person, the person who's actually trying to follow the Eightfold Path. And who has time to do that, right? Because you have to give up everything, you have to give up your livelihood, you have to go join a monastery, and the rest of us, portionos, are, we have to work for a living. And so the Mahayana school says, well, you don't actually have to do all of this. You can rely on the bodhisattvas, you can rely on a variety of Buddhas to attain enlightenment and to reach. They have an idea of paradise too. It's not just nirvana, but extinguishing the desire, an actual paradise that you can reach. So it appeals to a sort of, they call themselves the greater vehicle because supposedly they need more souls than the drudgery of trying to follow the Eightfold Path by yourself. By the way, sometimes the Theravada school is called Hinayana, which means lesser vehicle, which was the derogatory term the Mahayana school came up with to put down the Theravada school. So be careful if you're talking to a Theravada, but still refer to it as Hinayana. Okay, so Mahayana is the one that travels all over East Asia. So next I want to show you a little bit about how that happens. So it starts in India around 500 BC, and it takes different routes. So this is actually the earliest route. The Theravada Buddhism moves southward to Sri Lanka, and then across into Southeast Asia, and then from there upwards into China. And arriving in the Han Dynasty, 1st and 2nd century, is the sort of earliest record we have of Buddhist monks arriving in China. And then from there it actually moves to Tibet. And then from there it moves into Korea, and then from Korea over to Japan, and then later directly from China to Japan as well. So this is a handy sort of map which shows you the different times and the different routes. And then later it moves out of India again, much later in the 6th or 7th century, maybe into that as well. So it's color-coded. All of this is Mahayana Buddhism. And then, of course, Buddhism kind of died out and into the proper. It's not practiced very much. So it's most likely through trade that Buddhism traveled, probably along the Silk Road as well. It's coming from India. And it's sort of the Buddhists, many of the merchants themselves were believers in Buddhism, and many Buddhist monks traveled with trade caravans. And there was a kind of original interest in China in Buddhism for its promises of elixirs of immortality. Right? So there's a bit of a confusion about Nirvana actually meaning attaining a state of immortality, and then some of the sort of savvier, I guess, merchants started talking about different potions and formulas to buy. And so the original interest in Buddhism actually was a very kind of mundane one, how to live longer, how to improve your health. But that started as an interest. And then there became a demand for translations of texts, the sutras from Sanskrit into Chinese. So some of the famous, there's a very famous translator named Kumara Jiva that came from Central Asia and came to China and helped translate all sorts of texts. Now, you can imagine that the doctrine of Buddhism is very much antithetical to Confucianism. Right? Confucianism is about family relationships and knowing your status in society. And Buddhism is saying, no, you need to sever all of these ties in society and extinguish your desire and attachment and give up family. And these two things are quite antithetical. But despite that, there was an explosion in Buddhism. And by 500 of the Common Era, there's accounts of at least 10,000 temples that were built across China. And actually temples, particularly sort of cave temples, were very popular, and they started stretching from China all the way into Korea. They never really made it to Japan, but they also stretched south to Vietnam. And so the whole network of temples, and sort of in west as well, in Central Asia. So across the whole Chinese mainland, up into Korea and down to Vietnam, there's a whole sort of network of temples and cave temples. As a sort of physical network of Buddhism. And at one count there were about 160,000 monks and nuns that lived at these temples. Buddhism was very open to women. The nuns were able to participate as well. And there were temples that were dedicated to women, and there were female bodhisattvas. The most famous female bodhisattva, Guan Yin, actually started out in India as a male bodhisattva. By the time he arrived in China, somehow he transformed into a female bodhisattva. And then he also went to Japan and China and Korea as well. And let's face it, in the Confucian system, many women had very sort of limited avenues. They first were a daughter, and then they were supposed to become a wife and a mother, and serve their father's family, their husband's family. And so this is an alternative lifestyle. If they didn't want that, or they failed in that, or they left that, they could go and become nuns as well. So it became a sort of popular alternative avenue for women. And actually, many very famous female poets were also Buddhist and Taoist nuns. There's a beginning of a lot of travel from China to the west at this period, going in search of sutras. Of course, a very famous journey made in Hong Kong called the Journey to the West with Tipitaka, Tanpa, and the Monkey King, and Dubaja, and also Shai. We'll get to that maybe when I talk about the Hong Kong. There's some other points I want to make about Buddhism. A lot of this is actually covered in the textbook too, so just giving you kind of overview. So the Mahayana was the main family of schools of Buddhism in China at the time, and then those are broken down into two different types of schools. And you read some of these sutras from these schools in your source book for tomorrow. You'll be fascinated. The Lotus School or Tiantai School, I think you read some selections from the Lotus Sutra, and the Huayan and Flower Garland School. I didn't read those selections, but reading that to get through. These are schools which, if you sort of believe certain things, certain doctrines, and follow certain rules and doctrinal schools have to follow certain doctrines and a certain path of belief, will be saved. Whereas practice schools say you do certain things, will be saved. So doctrinal, you sort of have to believe in certain thought system or doctrine. Practice schools where you actually have to carry out certain practices. So there's a bit of a break between the two types of schools. And so the practice schools don't have actually much respect for the text. So the Tentai, the Lotus School, the Flower Ground School, they have central sutras. You're supposed to memorize the sutras. You're supposed to reproduce them as text, as calligraphy, as embroidery, whatever way you can in order to gain good karma. The practice schools, they don't have much use for text. The most famous practice school, I suppose, would be the Chan or Zen schools in Japan, which believe that you reach enlightenment through sudden insight, not through studying text. But you suddenly one day see the whole world in a different way, and then through that you can attain enlightenment. It's not about studying text. The Pure Land School was very popular among a broad swath of the Chinese population. It didn't demand much from you except just to chant something over and over again, which is the name of the Amitabha Buddha. And if you said the name of the Amitabha Buddha over and over again, and the more you said it, the better you would gain good karma. And eventually, you wouldn't be a saint of Valley, you'd actually be taken to a Pure Land, this wonderful sort of heavenly paradise. The Amitabha Buddha himself would come down and take you there upon your death. And so that was a pretty low threshold, right? You could chant something over and over. So these are the two types of Buddhism that's been popular in China for some reason. But another major reason is Buddhism received royal patronage both in the north and in the south. So the Wei Kingdom, the Full-Bao Wei Kingdom, was basically a Buddhist kingdom. They took Buddhism as their state doctrine. Some of the southern dynasties, they varied in their adherence to Buddhism. Some of the emperors of the southern dynasties were devout Buddhists, and other ones were suspicious of the Buddhists because they had a lot of power and land in their temples. But one emperor of the southern dynasties loved Buddhism so much that he constantly would kidnap himself by running off to a Buddhist temple, and he refused to come out until the court would pay ransom to the temple to bring him back to court. I'm not going to go back to court until you pay them a certain amount of money. So he took it to quite an extreme. And these temples that I mentioned, whole network of temples, also became integrated into popular Chinese culture. So not only for Buddhist practice, but it became sites for popular festivals, a lot of stunning visual art in and around these temples. They became a network of informal inns, where when you're traveling, you go and stay at a temple, and they would feed you if you would like to stay for a small fee. And so it became very much part of the fabric of Chinese life. And there are a few sort of stunning artifacts that are left over. I've given you one from the north, Yunnan, from the Wei Kingdom. It's huge. I don't know if this person in this picture for scale, but the person would probably be the biggest pointer there. These huge carvings of Yunnan. And the most famous, perhaps, cave temples, a whole complex of cave temples in Gansu province in the extreme northwest on the Silk Road, at a place called Whitmont, which are being excavated recently. You can visit. There are thousands of other caves and temples covered all over China. And so the translation of sutras were a conduit for Buddhism to enter Japan and Korea as well. It spurred on the other statement, sorry, I'm rushing to get this through again. The other influence, besides translation and text traveling throughout East Asia, within China, Buddhism also spurred on the development of Taoism. Right? So as the Buddhist temples exploded, so too did the network of Taoism will also explode over the landscape. And they came up with their own canon of scriptures to match the Buddhist canon of scriptures. And so by this point, by the end of the Six Dynasties, we can talk about China as having what are known as the Sound Jiao, and the pre-teaching, originally Confucianism and then Taoism, and now a fully sinified Chinese version of Buddhism added that to that as well. So next week, we will have the midterm for the first hour of class, and then I'll give a quick lecture on Sui and Han China and the role of culture in the so those are the readings for next week.